This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 30 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. And for today's episode, we will be looking at Week 8 waiver wire targets. But before we get started, I wanted to ask a favor. If you are listening, especially on Apple Podcasts, I'd ask that you would not only subscribe, but leave a review. Leaving a review is the best way for us to climb in the rankings and for other listeners to help find the show. In addition, if you want to interact and follow the show on Twitter, we are at FFAlchemistPod. Again, it is at FFAlchemistPod. And you can also email the show directly with any questions or comments. We are at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now, for the quarterback position this week, there's one recommendation. And if you were listening to the show in previous weeks or following us on Twitter, again, at FFAlchemistPod, you would know that we've been recommending Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray now for a number of weeks. The market is still a little bit behind. Right now he is available in 75% of ESPN leagues. And look, even if you don't need a quarterback, I still think you should be targeting Kyler Murray for your bench, and especially if you have an open IR spot. Now, coming up to Week 8, I still think he is most likely going to miss Week 8. I think he's going to be back in the lineup in either Week 9 or Week 10. Now, historically, Kyler Murray has been one of the best quarterbacks for fantasy football. Over his career, he averages over 20 fantasy points a game, which would put him in the top 5. He has consistently been in the top 5 in points per game for his entire career. Now, I understand the rushing upside is likely suppressed coming off the knee injury, but he is free. You can have him as a quarterback 2 and a bye-week streamer, or you can use him as a trade asset. I own Murray in a number of redraft leagues, and I'm already lining up trade offers to quarterback-needy teams targeting a flex-worthy starter back. Now, there are a number of options at the running back position this week, but first we're going to target the Bears running back unit. Both Roschon Johnson at 46% owned and D'Onta Foreman at 49% owned are just below 50% owned across ESPN leagues. Now, I mentioned on last week's episode on waiver wire targets and also last week's episode on recommended starters, I talked about the Bears' backfield. Now, Roschon Johnson missed his second straight game from Week 4 after the concussion, but D'Onta Foreman was incredible in Week 6. He had over 100 total yards, 16 carries plus 5 targets, and he had 3 total touchdowns. He had 33 fantasy points. Now, I also talked how the Bears have liked to concentrate their running back opportunities in positive and neutral game scripts, meaning that they haven't really used a committee approach in competitive games. And they use their running back group more when Justin Fields is out of the lineup. And the Bears have already said that Justin Fields is doubtful for Week 8. With that said, I believe when healthy, Roschon Johnson will be the running back 1 over D'Onta Foreman. However, both are less than 50% owned in ESPN leagues, and I would recommend both as waiver targets for this week. My second recommendation at the running back position is going to be Titans rookie running back Tyjae Spears, currently owned in 34% of ESPN leagues. Now, Spears has played over 50% of snaps in all but one game so far this year. And Spears is averaging an impressive 5.5 yards per carry, and he has a better yards before contact, missed tackle rate, and broken tackle rate than teammate Derrick Henry. Now, the reason for this recommendation is first, Tyjae Spears has been very good on the few opportunities he's had. He just hasn't had enough volume yet to be fantasy relevant. However, his path to volume could be near. First, the Titans will likely need to rely more on their ground game with Ryan Tannehill hurt again. It's also possible that Derrick Henry could get hurt. It's possible the Titans could move to play their younger players in the second half of the season if they fall out of the playoff mix early. And there's also a lot of rumors swirling about that Derrick Henry could be a trade candidate, which would open up the running back 1 position for Spears. He is a high priority stash that could turn into a weekly top 20 option for the second half of the season. Now, after the Bears and Titans backfield, I'd recommend you target the Panthers backfield. Now, first, Miles Sanders has some limited availability right now. He is available in 20% of ESPN leagues. And teammate Chuba Hubbard is currently owned in only 46% of leagues, so slightly under 50%. Now, the Panthers had a bye week in Week 7. Miles Sanders missed Week 6 with a multitude of injuries. And there's no immediate reports that he will be available in Week 8, but I'm placing my waiver claim with that expectation. From weeks 1 to 3, Sanders had about a 2-to-1 snap share lead over Hubbard. He averaged 7 targets a game. He was averaging 12 fantasy points a game. However, as his injuries were mounting, his snap participation and his production dipped, and it allowed Chuba Hubbard to take control of the backfield. Without Sanders in the lineup, Hubbard had 16 fantasy points in Week 7. He had 90 total yards and a touchdown. Now, I would prioritize Miles Sanders if he were available. Again, it's only limited. And Hubbard is nothing more to me right now than a bench stash in the event that Sanders were to miss more games. Keep in mind, Hubbard only broke 50% snap participation and 10 fantasy points once this year when Miles Sanders was also active. The next running back option will be Browns running back Kareem Hunt, currently owned in 46% of ESPN leagues. Now, starter Jerome Ford, he left Week 7 with an ankle injury. There's no immediate reports on how long he will be out, but I would bet at this point that he misses Week 8. That leaves recently re-signed Kareem Hunt as the running back 1 role going into Week 8. Now, Hunt played his highest snap rate in Week 6, but he had a thigh injury that prevented him from taking a lion's share of snaps in Week 7 when Ford exited the game. Nevertheless, Hunt scored 2 touchdowns last week. He now has 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. He has over 15 fantasy points in both. Now, continue to monitor the health of both Ford and Hunt throughout the week. I expect Hunt to be available in Week 8, but if both are out, then Pierre Strong becomes a streaming option out of default. Now, if you're unable to acquire any of the backfields and running backs that I just mentioned, there's 2 other options that I think you can put a waiver claim in for, but I'm not optimistic on either, but they are worth mentioning. First, let's talk about Gus Edwards of the Baltimore Ravens. He's currently at 50% owned in ESPN leagues. Now, on Sunday, he had 14 carries, 64 yards, a touchdown, and he had 1 80-yard reception. He had 21 fantasy points. Now, prior to Sunday, Gus Edwards was averaging only 7 fantasy points per game. He had 1 game over 10 points in that span. Now, you really have to be careful here. 15 of Edwards' 21 fantasy points came on 2 plays. Now, he took a check down reception for 80 yards. He had 1 target in the entire game. He took it 80 yards, and then he had a 2-yard touchdown dive. Edwards has consistently hovered around 50% snap participation, and he's been around 14 to 18 total opportunities a game, and that was the case again in Week 7. I would not expect significant change in his workload going forward, and I think it's unreasonable to expect to hit on 2 big plays a game for Gus Edwards. Now, the other option is going to be Texans running back Devin Singletary. He is currently at 26% owned. The Texans were on a bye week in Week 7, but in Week 6, Devin Singletary outsnapped Dameon Pierce for the first time this season. However, Singletary still only played 54% of snaps. He had 14 total opportunities, but he scored 7 fantasy points. Now, the Texans' backfield looks more like a committee situation moving forward, with neither Pierce or Singletary having any moderate target volume to go with it. This is a situation that I'm more down on Pierce than I am high on Singletary. So to recap my running back priorities this week, I would target the Bears backfield first. I would go Roschon Johnson over Deontay Foreman. Then I would target Tajay Spears. Then I would target the Carolina Panthers backfield with Miles Sanders over Chuba Hubbard. Then Kareem Hunt. And then if truly desperate and you don't hit on any of those, it would be Gus Edwards and then Devin Singletary. As for the wide receiver position, there is one player with limited availability right now. I think that's worth checking, and that is Steelers wide receiver Deontay Johnson. He is currently available in 20% of ESPN leagues. Now, he returned in Week 7. He had 5 passes for 79 yards in his return. He only played 66% of snaps. Now, he's consistently played over 90% of snaps when healthy, so he's clearly ramping up here in the coming weeks to get back above 90% snap rate. Johnson was still targeted on a quarter of his routes run, which is on par with last season. I think Deontay Johnson should be a solid flex option in Week 8. Another player who's just over 50% right now is Seahawks rookie Jackson Smith-Njigba, currently at 56% owned. Now, even with DK Metcalf out in Week 6, JSN did not see any considerable jump in his snap participation. In fact, it actually dropped from 72% the prior week to 63% on Sunday. But JSN led the Seahawks with 7 targets, a 29% target share, in DK Metcalf's absence, which was a season high. And not only is JSN seeing a bump in targets, but most importantly, his average depth of target is increasing. Check this out. From week 1 through 7, here has been his average depth of target. 1, 2.3, 4.3, 5.8, 7.4, and then 10.3 last week here in week 7. Now continue to monitor Metcalf's health, but JSN I think can be safely moved into your starting lineup in week 8 if DK Metcalf is out again. After that, we got to talk about a pair of rookies, both of which I mentioned on the Don't Be Afraid to Start Them episode, and both players had a very good week 7. Now first let's talk about Chiefs rookie wide receiver Rashee Rice. He is at 49% owned, so still available in half of ESPN leagues. Now, Rashee Rice is narrowing the gap on snap participation. This is really the key for him, where he had been trailing MVS and Sky Moore by a fairly wide margin through the early part of the season. Rashee Rice was only slightly below those two players in Week 7 when it comes to snap counts. But he had a season-high 59% snap participation and a season-high in the number of routes run. Now, Rashee Rice has also exceeded 10 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games, and the rookie has emerged as the number 2 fantasy option for Patrick Mahomes. The other rookie option is going to be Colts rookie Josh Downs, currently at 35% owned. Now, on Sunday, Downs had 5 catches on 6 targets for 125 yards and a touchdown. 4 of his last 5 games, he has been above 13 fantasy points, and he had his first game above 20 fantasy points on Sunday. And there's pretty clear splits with and without Anthony Richardson. With Richardson, Josh Downs was averaging 4.8 targets, 3.8 receptions, just under 50 receiving yards. Without Richardson, he's at 8.3 targets, 6 receptions, 68 receiving yards, and he scored 2 touchdowns. Right, that's a difference per game of 3.5 more targets, 2 more receptions, an additional 20 receiving yards, and then, of course, all of his touchdowns have come with Gardner Minshew and not Anthony Richardson. And then the last option at the wide receiver group is going to be Patriots receiver Kendrick Bourne, currently at 24% ownership. Now, over the last 2 weeks, Bourne has played over 90% of snaps. He's at almost 20 total targets in those 2 games. He is leading the team in back-to-back weeks. He has scored 19 fantasy points 2 weeks ago, and he had 16 more points yesterday. As long as Juju Smith-Schuster remains inactive, I think Bourne can continue to produce 10-plus fantasy scoring outings for the next few weeks. So to recap and prioritize the wide receiver room, double check that Deontay Johnson is not available in your league. Assuming he's not, I would prioritize the receivers this way: Jackson Smith-Njigba, Josh Downs, Rashee Rice, and then Kendrick Bourne. And then at the tight end position, there are 3 options this week, all 3 players below 50% ownership. But first, let's talk about Texans tight end Dalton Schultz, currently owned in 34% of ESPN leagues. Now, Schultz had 3 straight double-digit fantasy games prior to the Texans' Week 7 bye, and Schultz scored a touchdown in all 3 of those games. Furthermore, the last 2 games for the Texans, Schultz is leading the team in targets, with a target share approaching 30% and a target per route run rate at nearly 40%. Option 2 is going to be Cowboys second-year player Jake Ferguson, currently owned in 44% of ESPN leagues. Now, the Cowboys were also on a bye in Week 7, but the prior week, Jake Ferguson played nearly every snap in 11 personnel. He had his highest snap participation of his career the prior week at 85%, and he ran 32 routes, both of which were career highs. Now, the problem in that game is that his targets decreased dramatically. He caught his only target after seeing at least 3 targets in every other game and at least 7 targets in 3 of his first 5. If Ferguson can match his playing time from the Week 6 game with his target rate from the early season games, he would become a must-start fantasy tight end. And then the last option will be Bills rookie tight end Dalton Kincaid, currently at 31% ownership. Now, Kincaid saw his highest target count of the season. He had 8 targets, and he caught all of them for 75 yards, which was a 22% target share. Now, Kincaid's playing time, snap participation, it wasn't much higher than we've seen in previous weeks, but his target rate was. Kincaid will need to either continue to have a high target rate in the coming weeks, or he's going to need more playing time to become a reliable starting tight end. With that being said, as I'm recording this on Monday evening, there's breaking news that fellow tight end Dawson Knox is suffering from a wrist injury and will most likely need surgery and is probably looking at a multi-week injury. So his path to more playing time is now clearly there with Dawson Knox out of the picture for a few weeks. So with that being said, I would rank Dalton Kincaid first due to the absence of Dawson Knox out of the lineup, and then I would go Schultz and Ferguson. I like all three, but I would order them Kincaid, Schultz, and Ferguson. So that'll wrap up episode 30 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Again, if you're listening and you enjoy the show, I'd ask that you do a favor, not only subscribe, but leave a review, and that'll help us find other listeners. We will be back with more episodes later this week. We'll do a full recap of Week 7 observations and trends from around the league, and then we'll look ahead to Week 8 with players you should not be afraid to start. So for Dustin Chandry signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.